So add to your godliness, brotherly kindness. Let's just start off with the first question. That kind of gives us a segue into the lesson. What connection does brotherly kindness have with the preceding godliness? I think there's an ascending nature in this list, but obviously there's no being dogmatic about why exactly did Peter put it in this order, because he didn't really tell us, but we can develop the relationship between these terms. So what would you say, do you see, is a connection? Why brotherly kindness after godliness, Larry?
I have godliness as affection towards God, and brotherly kindness as affection towards brethren.
Okay.
So there's definitely a connection.
Okay.
Jeremiah,
Yes.
would you say from the lesson that we just did then that it would be part of the dispositions that was discussed, that you brought out in the lesson, that this would be one of those dispositions then?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely involves our attitude, and it's growing out of a prior attitude. And so, yeah, definitely, I think that would be the case. It's kind of it comes from a mindset that we have for one another. Anybody have anything else? Okay.
See that same spiritual bond in others, the godliness in the previous one. We love and appreciate them for their efforts.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, at least how I understand it to a great degree, and it's kind of a combination of all three comments there. Godliness is it's not necessarily affection, like Larry was saying, but when you have a reverence for God, and Carrie has a reverence for God, and Aaron has a reverence for God, we're connected, aren't we? Because we all have a reverence for God. And so you kind of feed off one another in that regard, and you care for each other. And I think that's why it follows godliness. When, godliness really makes everything that comes before it really have focus. And so I'm learning, I am controlling myself, I'm doing that in a continual way through trial and tribulation, I'm persevering. And as I do all that, I'm starting to develop, as I continue to learn and continue to apply and continue to endure, a greater reverence and respect for God who's trying to lead my life. And that kind of makes it what this life is all about. I'm thinking about why God put me here and what does He want from me. And if we have some mutual understanding of that, and we are mutually devoted to God, then we're going to have an affection for one another. I mean, you think about it in regard to some things as simple as like being a sports fan. And I can tell you, well, I can't count probably how many times I've been with Zoe's family, and we're like on vacation, we see a Chiefs hat, and they go out of their way to say, "Hey, a Chiefs fan," We don't know them, but we have an affection for them, don't we? And I think all of us can relate to that. And it can be even simple matters. You're in, you might remember in school that you find yourself put in a group, and you didn't get to choose the group, and you're kind of wondering how this is going to work out. But it's kind of a competitive type exercise, and you form a bond with people in that group that you would probably have never talked to as a kid. Because you've got mutual focus and a goal, and you've kind of been brought together. And so I think that's the idea. When we're all godly and we're spiritually minded, we're focused on God's will, we're going to be connected together in a way. And it really comes naturally. But as we know, it's going to have to take work, because there are plenty of obstacles to it, plenty of things that try to get in our way. I have appreciated over the years hearing the illustration when we're talking about fellowship, but also marriage, that God is at the top of the triangle. And so, if you're over here and you have fellowship with God, and this person over here has fellowship with God, you have fellowship with one another. Whereas as you marry someone who's growing closer to God, and you're growing closer to God, you're getting closer to each other. I mean, that's kind of the idea. We're connected in that way. God brings us together, and we're going to have a kind of affection for one another in that regard. Does that make sense? Does anyone have anything to add to that before we get to definition? All right. Yes, Dave.
It's also the caring concern to help each other get ready. The
Yeah.
outright love for their soul.
Yeah, if you see that connection and it brings those affections, that means you're going to want what's best for them, and you're going to be able to look out for them. But and that's where you start to get the distinction, and we'll see that between agape and Philadelphia, because sometimes we ironically allow the affections we have for one another based in our mutual devotion to God and the truth kind of blind us from doing the more difficult things of love, like convicting one who's in sin of their sin to bring them out of it. I've grown to have such an affection for them that I don't want to be offensive to them. But that's where love takes over the feelings. And we're going to make that distinction in a moment. So Wuest's Word Studies says that Philadelphia, that's the word for brotherly kindness, is made up of phileo, to have an affection for, and adelphos, a brother. Strong says it is fraternal affection. And Arton Gingrich says it is love of brother or sister. And then Thayer says it's love of brothers or sisters, brotherly love, but then he makes the specific definition of it in regard to the context of the New Testament, that it is the love which Christians cherish for each other as brethren. And so Philadelphia is used in secular context to refer to really something that comes naturally, doesn't it? Now, we know the caveat that brothers and sisters fight all the time. They don't get along. They love each other. They have an affection for one another. And so, big sister picks on big brother, or big brother picks on little brother. And, when someone else picks on them, you can't do that. Only I can do that. So there's this kind of bond that's formed. And it happens naturally. When you're around your family all the time, you share things together, and you feed off of each other's characters and likes and dislikes. You have a strong affection for one another. It happens naturally. That's really what Philadelphia is secularly, when we're not talking about spiritual context. And so when we see a family, and it may even be something that has happened in our own families, and we got to investigate what is the foreign idea or problem coming into this that's messing everything up. But we see a family that doesn't get along, and there's some rivalry there, and maybe even legitimate hatred for each other, and you can't stand to be around each other. You see a family like that, you kind of scratch your head wondering, what in the world went wrong there? What's happening? Because that's not normal. Usually families are very close. Some are closer than others. Some are more distant than others. But family is a universal thing that we think about in regard to closeness. And that's something I think we actually value. It makes us feel good when we are driving down the road and we see a family walking together in the park or something like that, because we've got that same experience and we see the value in it. And so that's the kind of thing we're thinking about. But it's on a spiritual level. And we know the absence of that on a physical level means there's something that's wrong. And I think it's the same thing with the spiritual thing as well. When we lack in brotherly affection for our spiritual family, something's wrong. And that's why we need to work on it. And it doesn't necessarily come as natural as it does physically, because it's something learned. But certainly there is a natural air about it in regard to, like I said, when we have mutual value in something, we're going to be, attracted to each other in that regard as well, like a magnet pulls together. And so that's what brotherly kindness is. But in a spiritual way, it's emphasizing the relationship we have with God through Christ. You remember the saying on page 59, it's alluded to, that blood is thicker than water. I've actually looked around on this. I don't know that anybody can for sure hammer down the exact beginning of that and its original meaning, but I read something about before that the blood of the battlefield is thicker than the water of the womb, and it's a phrase that soldiers used in regard to how much closer they are even than if they were physical brothers, because we're shedding blood together on the battlefield, and that's brought us together. I think more times than not, we just simply understand it to be that when we are blood relatives, when we are family, that is more important and stronger than anything else. Nothing comes between me and family. But really what we should be thinking as Christians is that the blood of Christ is thicker than the water of the womb. The blood of Christ is more powerful than just me being related to someone physically. If I am related to someone spiritually through the blood that Jesus spilled himself of his own free will according to the eternal will of God, that means a whole lot more than just I happen to be born into the same family as this person. I'm not downplaying the special nature of that, but this is what brotherly kindness is. And so we should value it as such. You have comments or questions? I've been going. Yes, Kurt.
Well, I think Jesus left a few people scratching his head when he said, "Who are my mother and who are my brothers?"
Yeah.
Because the spiritual bond is stronger than the family bond, and those who seek to love Him and to love God have a stronger bond than those that are born into the same family.
Yeah, and that's where what you're going to observe inevitably at times, what separates true conviction from merely I'm doing this because it's how I was raised, or because a lot of other people that I like are doing it. When you see Christians that aren't in the same family or even the same, you might say, inner circle in regard to mutual likes and dislikes and stuff, get along really well, and they can spend the whole day together, talking together, and it's usually about spiritual things and stuff like that. And you've got another Christian who should be having the same values, just can't understand how you can spend a whole day with someone like that. Well, it's probably a red flag telling you that you're not as convicted as you think you are. Because Jesus, like Kurt alluded to in Mark 3:31 through 35, and in other Gospels as well, obviously, they came to him and said, "Your mother and brothers and sisters are outside." And he said, "Who are my family except these who do the will of my Father?" Pointed to a bunch of people he didn't grow up with, that he had no fleshly relationship with, but that were following the will of God and seeking truth. And that's important. That's getting ahead of ourselves, how we cultivate this affection for one another. You got to take care of your own affections toward God first. And when you truly do love God and you value the things that He values and His will becomes your own, then everyone else who's doing the same, you're going to inevitably grow closer to them. And so that's important. Remember in 1 Corinthians 8, when you had some people that were abusing liberties and they were eating meat that had been offered to idols, even though their brethren were wounded by that, what Paul said to them in verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 8, "Because of your knowledge shall the weak," not person, he says brother. And there's a reason throughout Scripture when, the address is beloved or brethren, that's a term of endearment. It's to draw our minds to that kind of connection. "Shall your knowledge make the weak brother perish for whom Christ died?" And that's what he's drawing on. He's talking about them doing something that is not God's will, and you need to realize that on this factual level. But you should care for him. Why would you do something that would hurt him? And so it's kind of a wall that, separates us from, things that would jeopardize our relationships as well if it's governed by the right thing. Jeff?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, this love can sometimes maybe make it more difficult to show the agape love as we should in correction. But at the same time, this affection that we have and being kind is also what allows us to be long-suffering with a weak brother, as Paul mentioned, or with those that we're commanded to do as well. And sometimes that's the harder thing to do, especially with someone who seems to repeat things and all that. And how many times do you forgive, and how long-suffering are we? And so this affection is very important, and this kindness.
Yeah, and they're not mutually exclusive. They're different, but they're intertwined. And we're going to see that in 1 Peter chapter 1. But that's an excellent point, because that is why it's important. And we're going to talk about in a moment, well, right now. There's a difference between agape and Philadelphia. But you might have heard someone say, I love person over here, Christian, my brother, but I don't have to like him. You ever heard that? Heard of it?
Growing up, I heard that.
Yeah, exactly. they don't understand the command of brotherly
Well,
kindness.
first of all, not from my parents, but from
Sure.
where we attended. I want to clarify that.
I've heard my parents all the time. Be careful. Yeah, but that's a legitimate feeling that some people have. You know, I don't have to get along with them, but I do need to love them. No, brotherly kindness means we get along. It doesn't mean that all things are sunshine and rainbows all the time. There are going to be some inevitable things that happen as Satan's trying to tear us apart that we got to deal with, and it's frustrating, and wounds will be inflicted, and scars will always be there. Sometimes you can't, you might not think of a person the same as you used to ever again, and that's legitimate because, you know, that your reputations are damaged, all that kind of stuff, but that doesn't mean we love them but we never like them. You know, that's not scriptural if we understand brotherly kindness. And so that's important. Agape, though, in Philadelphia are different, and that's question number 3, actually. And so we just defined brotherly kindness, but how does Philadelphia differ from agape? What would you say are the distinguishing characteristics? And, you know, Riley's going to delve into agape on Sunday. He's going to tell us perfectly what it means. But what distinction would you make? I say that because it's like one of those words that, how do you define it? Well, we're going to see what it looks like. So he's going to do an excellent job. But what are your thoughts?
Agape is more of a, you always do what's in the best interest of the object loved.
Yes.
And phileo is more of a touching, or not touching, but more of a physical.
Touchy feely. Yeah.
Emotional thing that-
That's an excellent way of describing it. Agape always does what's in the best interests of its object. And then there's an affectionate, feely type of a thing with Philadelphia, or phileo, which is, you know, that compound part of it. Possible.
Oh, I was going to say the same thing. Philadelphia highlights the affection. Agape is the acts of service.
Yeah.
But even if you have agape love for someone, you should still have feelings for them. I mean, I've heard people say, well, you do stuff for someone and have no feelings for them, but that's hard for me to do.
Yeah, well, and that's how these play off one another. If I'm having trouble, if Foster's gotten on my nerves, and I don't like him, but I'm going to have to love him, well, if I feel that way and that's real, then I need to do something about it, because we need to have affection for each other. And maybe that's what I start doing. Start serving you, and that's going to build an affection as well. And I think that's how we see it as parents, too. You know, you bring me a kid with a poopy diaper. If it's not my kid, I'm not going to want to do that. But and I'm certainly not going to have the same feelings I have for with that kid as I do for my kids. And it plays off one another. No one likes to change a poopy diaper, but we do it because we love our children. And even those acts of service kind of build the affection. And so it all plays off one another. Oh, yes, sorry.
Sorry. I was going to say phileo, I believe, is largely associated with a sense of shared experience where people
Okay.
are intimately knit together.
Yeah.
And you think of like fraternity, if you will. You think of maybe, you know, people go through fraternities, or maybe they've experienced combat together.
Mm-hmm.
And that sense of shared experience that is something that they can only experience amongst one another, but not outside of, you know,
Yeah.
outsiders don't share that same sense of fraternity and that intimacy that's knit through that.
Yeah.
And I think phileo is largely associated with a sense of maturity, in a sense of when you have agape love towards them, it's almost like in the King James version of pity. You pity them, like you see their need, and you're going to lean towards them and provide for their needs from a sense of your awareness of their need and your willingness to satisfy it.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, phileo is more a person-to-person intimacy, and agape is more of a, you know, having spiritual and loving maturity when looking towards others. It doesn't mean that you're
Yeah.
above them,
Right.
but these are all instances of God's character that He wants to influence us with. He
Yeah.
wants to see others. He wants us to see others and the world the way that He does,
Yeah.
in the various different, you know, circumstances and relational attributes that they manifest themselves.
Yeah, That's an excellent way of putting it. And those are the factors that play into agape and Philadelphia. When you share experiences with people, that's going to bring you together. And if you walk across the street and walk by someone that you've never seen in your life, you haven't shared any experiences with them. You don't know them. You don't know of any commonalities. There's not a relationship there. So there really can't be an automatic kind of affection in that regard. We have a general affection, I think, for humankind because we share in humanity. But this is that deeper point. And then I love how you put it, that agape is the more spiritually mature thing that we do, where I don't need affection for you to do what is best for you spiritually. And that's the difference, I think, in Matthew 5, Jesus talks about how, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate those who are your enemies. But I say, love your enemies and bless those. This is agapeo, the verb form of agape. Bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. And then it goes on to say, you shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And that's that kind of perfect, meaning complete and mature, as your Father in heaven is. And that's where agape and I think Philadelphia are separate. I can remember when I first began preaching in Louisiana, I don't know what I preached on, but someone came up to me, and it had to do with apparently loving enemies and stuff. But I probably said something about terrorism and stuff like that too. And their question was, I just don't see how I'm supposed to be able to love those people that hate us and want to blow up our buildings and kill all our people. I don't see how I could do it. Well, it's because you're not seeing the distinction. It's obviously not going to be possible for us to have that kind of affection for them, brotherly love. It doesn't work that way. But you agape or agapeo them. And one of the ways you express that is by praying for them. If you have opportunity, preaching them the gospel, trying to get them to repent, that kind of stuff. So that's, I think, where the distinction is mainly, or rather, I guess, in the greatest way, emphasized. We got to love our enemies, but he's not saying that you have affection for your enemies. We don't see that required. We see love required, and I think that we can understand that. Yes, ma'am.
What you're giving to us in these examples is not what we see generally in the world. When they talk about God as love and love one another, often they are referring to tolerance. Tolerate anything to get along.
Yes, ma'am.
And that is not true love.
Right.
Either agape or the others that we're discussing.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. And that's why we've got to, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, by God's will. We got to change the way we think by seeing God's mind and realize that, the things that they may say semantically may be the same, using the same words, but they're not meaning the same thing. That's a great point. All right, let's look at the nature of brotherly kindness. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 1, and I want us to notice a sentence there. And so the nature of Philadelphia on a physical level is, I'm born into my family, therefore I have affection for them, and it's something that comes naturally. Well, just like that springs from a birth, so does our brotherly kindness spiritually. And so, someone read 1 Peter 1 and verse 22, please.
Since you have purified your souls in obeying truth through the spirit and sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, that's not. I was looking at the book. You read enough. So I think someone mentioned it before that these are intertwined and stuff, and I think it might have been Foster that was talking about that. But if you have an affection for someone, then you're going to agape them, and if you don't have an affection for them, as you agape them, you're going to grow an affection for them. Well, I want us to notice that he says that in verse 22, he tells them, sincere love of the brethren, you've purified your souls and obeyed the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren. And then he says, love one another fervently with a pure heart. Those are the two words for love. sincere love of the brethren. Love of the brethren is the translation of Philadelphia. And then the command in the passage, what he's telling them to do, is to agapeo your brethren. And so serve each other. Do what is best for each other. And that's the love that Jesus said in John 13, by this all will know you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. But what is it stemming from in this passage? Why am I agapeoing, loving my brethren? You've obeyed the truth. They have too. And so you have an affection for them, right? And that's essentially what he's saying here. And I'm just going to put all these up there so I don't forget to. But you've got the command to love, but he says, since you have obeyed the truth, purified your souls through the Spirit. But then he says, in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. Well, notice what that looks like in a moment when we break down the language a little bit more. But he says that you have obeyed the truth, purified your souls. And notice in verse 23, he says, having been born again. And so this verse looks back. It's another reason for it, but it's looking back. And it says basically that you're loving each other having been born again. The reason you're doing it is because you were born again. And so what has happened is, as I've obeyed the truth through the Spirit, I was born again into a family. That's what the whole context is really looking at. You notice in verse 3 of chapter 1 in 1 Peter, he talks about how he has begotten us again to a living hope. And then you look down in verse 14, he talks about how they're obedient children. And then in verse 17, he talks about how we have a Father that we're calling upon, and we do so in fear or reverence. He says in verse 22, he says, sincere love of the brethren. And so you're a brother to someone. In fact, in chapter 5 of 1 Peter in verse 9, he says that after he says, be aware of Satan trying to devour you, he says, resist them steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. And then in chapter 2 and verse 10, you're the people of God. And then right before that, you're being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. What's the similarity we're seeing in all of these descriptions? It's in the book, so this is not off the wall.
Shared experience of sanctification.
Yeah, shared. These are descriptions of that are collective nouns. When you talk about a brotherhood, you're not talking about one person. You're talking about brethren together. Brethren is a collection of it. Children can mean one, but obviously here he's talking about the collection of the children of God. Holy priesthood is not just one priest, but it's a multiple priests in one priesthood. Even a house, built up a spiritual house. When the Bible talks about a house, sometimes it has reference to the actual, what would be technically called domicile, the abode, the physical structure. More often than not, it's talking about the people in it, even including the servants. A household is how we would put it. And so these are collective nouns, shared experiences. I'm a part of the same family. That's a collective noun. There's one family, but a family is comprised of multiple people. I'm part of the same group. There's one group, but there's multiple people that make up that group. And so when you have that, there is affection that comes naturally with it. And he explained it to a T earlier. So you have that in 1 Peter chapter 1, that because we've all been born of the same Father, in the same way, into the same family, we're going to have affection for each other. That doesn't mean that there's never anything that jeopardizes it, that challenges it. We've got to work on it. It is commanded. It sometimes doesn't come just easy. We've got to continue to develop the relationship. But by virtue of our common birth, there is going to be, at least to some level, an affection that we have for one another. Steve?
Might be jumping the gun a little bit. It looks like the second point is talking about the command. Husband and wife, as an elder, we talk to people in their relationships. And sometimes I
Right.
thing that we do with, blood relatives oftentimes, but, it's something that we're commanded to do, and it takes work and effort.
Yeah.
And it's not just a gushy feeling, which we've discussed.
Yeah. And I think that's a perfect parallel when, married people have been married so long and just don't love each other anymore. Well, that may be true, but it's your fault. You've got to work on that, and there's ways to develop that. How much time do you spend together? How many times do you say, we're going to do what you want to do tonight, not me, right? And, all of us could say that and speak to ourselves. Marriage takes work, and I'm 3 years in, and I already know that. And so that's a great parallel, and it's no different than what we're talking about here. I used to really get along with so-and-so at the congregation I'm a part of. Now we've grown apart. I really don't care much for them. No one would ever say that, but sometimes people feel that way. Well, you need to work on that, and we can work on that. It's a good point. Lots of questions. Yes, Kurt.
Well, it's obvious, but it still needs to be stated. There's a common thread in the scriptures that tell us that God expects us to learn whatever it is he commands.
Yeah.
Whether it is being a servant or being a leader. It doesn't matter if you're naturally leaning in that direction. It doesn't matter how your blood family was put together or if you even had one. God calls us to fulfill our roles as men and as women, husband and wives and brethren. He commands us to be what he expects us to be, and he gives no opportunity for sin. There's no out.
Yeah.
Right? It's like this idea, well, she's smarter than I am and she can make more money, so I'm going to stay home with the kids. Well, that might make sense from a worldly perspective,
Sure.
but that's not what God has called you to do.
Right.
I'm not a natural leader. I'm a natural follower. But I'm also a father and a husband. I've been an elder. Those are the things that you must learn.
Yeah.
So learning how to understand the differences in love and the recipients of that type of love
Yeah.
is what God calls us to do.
That's an excellent point because, you can have someone that is more of an affectionate person and someone that is more just kind of analytical and not as touchy-feely and stuff. Both of them are commanded to Philadelphia each other. And you can indeed learn. That's an excellent point. So the language there, it uses the Greek word eis. And we usually emphasize that in a passage like Acts 2:38. Eis is for the remission of sins. The denominations will try to tell us that means because your sins have been remitted. And we say no, that it's a preposition of, it's to or into the remission of sins. You're not there yet. Baptism gets you there, to or into the remission of sins. That's the word that's used, that you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren. He's saying when you obeyed the truth and were born again, it brought you into sincere love of the brethren, a fraternal affection, a Philadelphia. And the American Standard Version kind of renders it that way. Your obedience to the truth unto, or eis, unfeigned love of the brethren. And so that common spiritual birth brought us into, that was the segue into this fraternity, this affectionate community. And so it brings together people that you would have never thought would be affectionate toward each other. People of different walks of life. People of different cultures and genders, definitely, and people of different prior beliefs. But now we've shed those and accepted Christ, and we are brought into an affection. So Philemon, I think, is a great place to demonstrate that. Someone read Philemon 11 and 16. Philemon verse 11 and verse 16.
It once was a problem to you, but now it's profitable to you and to me. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord.
So that's kind of starting in the middle of the sentence, but we know what it's talking about. You've got Philemon, who is a slave owner, and Onesimus runs away from him. Paul converts him, and now he's telling him, he once was unprofitable to you, but now you receive him as a beloved brother of all things. You would have never thought a runaway slave would have any kind of affection shown him by his master when he returns. In fact, a lot of times they would be beaten and treated miserably. But when you're both Christians, now there's something different that's more powerful and should be acted upon there as well. Someone read Hebrews 13 and verses 1 and 2.
Let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing some have unwittingly entertained angels. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also.
Okay, thank you. So he says strangers there, and that's what hospitality means, an entertainment of strangers. But they're brethren that I don't know. Because they're brethren, I am going to show the proper affection because we're brethren. And so it's strong. A Christian can come in out of town and be going through and need a place to stay or need some help or a meal or whatever. And we're usually going to do that because they're our brethren. And I don't have to know them personally because we're connected in Christ. And so that's the kind of idea there. We'll continue there, Lord willing, on